Hi there. This is Andy from Able Training Support Limited, doing another one of my vlogs. So I thought I'd raise a bit of a subject I'd be really fascinated in people's opinion on this because I've heard multiple kind of points of view, and I come from a certain kind of school of thought, and I know many other people come from a different school of thought. So as far as it's basically around the whole premise of should staff be trained in restraint. So there's a few points of view on this. Obviously, no matter what, I completely agree that restraint should only ever be used as an absolute last resort when everything else has gone wrong. I recognise it being a potential deprivation of somebody's human rights and their liberty. The risk factors related to injury, both for the people doing the restraining and also for the individual being restrained as well. Everything we teach, everything we do is trauma informed with Able Training Support Limited, and we work on the principles of avoidance, preventative strategies, proactive strategies, responsive strategies related to managing behaviours of concern and hazardous behaviour. So I am not in any way advocating that restraint should be used, but it's whether staff should be trained in restraint. I came across one of the companies that we used to work for quite regularly, because obviously we deliver training in restraint, where they basically got taken over, and they decided that they weren't going to be doing any restraint training anymore. And I said, and that's absolutely fine. And I kind of gave my point of view over, and they disagreed, and they sort of said, we read a study that said that staff are more likely to engage in restraining if they're trained to restrain. And I found that really quite a fascinating thing. I've never managed to find what that study was, but I can imagine that it is out there. It's again one of those frustrating things for me where people don't necessarily know how to read statistics. And there's a big difference between correlation and causation. Is being trained in restraint something that increases the likelihood of people restraining? Or are people being trained in restraint because the environment they're working in is higher risk, and therefore the likelihood of them having to restrain is more likely? It's without further information on the study and how it is conducted and things like that, we don't know. I don't think it would be a very informative study particularly. The thing for me is is a principle better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. That's my concern. Because when they said about, well, it was a care company or a foster care company that said, well, I'd been teaching one part of it for a number of years, and they said, look, well, there's been no incidents of restraint in the environment you've taught in, but we've also had no incident restraint in our environment, and we've never done restraint training. And I found that quite interesting as well. And one of the things that I'd be interested in, though, is whether they generally hadn't had any restraint. One of the things that I know quite often when I've taught restraint training and taught it properly is that sometimes staff are behaving and engaging in restrictive practices, excuse my language today, practices towards the service users, but weren't even aware they were actually doing them. So an example in something like elderly care, where it's, for instance, they're leaving a lap table in front of somebody, even though there's no food on it, the staff may not be quite aware that that's actually inhibiting that person's movement, and therefore they are potentially restrained in that position, because it just hasn't occurred to them that, well, of course they don't have the physical strength to be able to move that table and then be able to still move. So that was the case, so then they weren't aware they were restraining. It's an unconscious restraint. So that wouldn't be recorded down as a restraint. And I know in something like foster care, there's many occasions where what would a parent tend to do if a child went to go running away from them within a supermarket? Well, they would grab them. Well, is that a restraint? Well, technically, yes, it is. And I can almost guarantee that there would have been foster carers in both environments that potentially were restraining, not recording them. But the big difference is that I know with the foster care company that I taught related to restraint and taught about, because of the way that we teach it, they would have known what restraint is, what constitutes a restraint, if they had to do it, how to do it safely, but also had the principles to avoid it and know that it was an absolute last resort when everything has gone wrong. But if they're going to record it, they would have recorded it properly. and known what that restraint was. And I think for me, that makes me feel more confident than the environment that said that I'd taught in that said they had no restraints was probably actually more likely to have genuinely had no restraints than the environment who'd never been trained in restraint and then said, hey, had no incidents of restraint. I hope that makes sense. And I think that's again, that's an assumption, and I don't have the figures to kind of back that up, but I think it's quite an interesting thing. One of the reasons this has come to my attention or raised, or I thought I'd do a little bit of a discussion on it, because I've just done a support meeting with a children's home that had had an incident of where they had to restrain a lad. It has been reviewed, and a complaint was made, and it got passed on to safeguarding. And the designated officer has ruled that it was completely justified and there was no safeguarding concerns related to the incident. Ofsted have also reviewed it and also said there is no concerns about the justification of the incident. The problem was that this particular environment, they ended up having to hold the lad. And when we say lad here, we are talking about a 16-year-old lad who's about 5'10", 5'11", built a similar size to me apparently, so taller but stocky and well built, who has on numerous occasions displayed quite aggressive behaviour. So even though we're working with a child here, we're working with a child who is man size in many ways. And what had happened is there was a few precursors, and when we went through the review, there was potentially things that the staff could have done preventatively before the day, not the day itself. The day itself, the staff behaved very professionally. They did their absolute best to de-escalate, to redirect. They tried to relocate the lad to a place where it was safer, where he could then move around and have space rather than anyway try and hold him. But unfortunately, this lad was absolutely focused on attacking this particular member of staff. It managed to push the member of staff a few times. The staff had moved away and they tried to switch and things like that. But it escalated to the point that the lad had to be held. And that had then taken the staff down to the floor. He'd gone down to the floor. First time he went down, they released to let him back up. Unfortunately, went straight back to the attack again. So the second time they felt they had to maintain the hold, to not to control him, but to control the risk. And this is always the way I refer it. It's a least restrictive measure to manage the risk. Unfortunately, the staff had never been trained in floor holds. Their policy stated that no floor holds should occur. Now, they've absolutely changed their policy to if a floor restraint does occur, it should be used for the minimum time possible, and all opportunities to relocate to a safer position be taken. So they've changed their wording within their policy. Now the staff are they are allowed to hold on the floor if it's a last resort. All other options have failed, and obviously appropriate dynamic risk assessments. And I do teach these staff. We teach them a lot about dynamic risk assessments and things like that. But now they're wondering whether they need to be taught floor holds. So when I did the assessment session with the few staff that are directly involved, I basically went through, well, how did you hold? And okay, well, these are the vulnerabilities to the way that you did it. These are where the injuries could have occurred the way you did it. I see and understand that you tried to do it the best you can, as far as turning the lad on the side, trying to make sure it's breathing and things like that. But otherwise, it had never been taught. And it wasn't an approved technique. It wasn't the technique that had been risk assessed or anything like that. They just had to wing it, so to speak. So now they're asking, well, should we have this training just in case? And it's a case of... I'm saying no, because at the moment they don't have a risk assessment or an individual emplacement where they feel that would be necessary. But they're still wondering, but what if we have somebody in tomorrow? We can't necessarily have that training immediately. And that's a difficult thing. Because even if they get trained now in it, well, then are they going to add that onto the refresher process? Are they going to do that training in that every year? Are they going to make sure they maintain those skills? Or is it a case of, if you don't use it, you lose it, and therefore how many months later, then something happens and they don't have the discipline or ability or the technique and the skills to actually then carry out that hold safely and appropriately for both the staff and for the individual they're supporting. So it's an interesting question, and I gave my answer of my kind of principle of I think no, unless the situation changes. So I don't think it should be a blanket thing that the staff are trained in. Only if an individual comes into the placement that they feel this may be a potential risk, and therefore they want to manage the risk appropriately by introducing the training to making sure if staff do have to do it, they're doing it safely. But it'll be interesting points of views. Do you think that being trained in restraint increases the likelihood of staff distraining? Is that something you've experienced and found? Or does it depend very much on the training model? And the fact that if you get good training, it actually almost, and one of the things I always try and do is put staff off restraining, saying this is last resort, everything else has gone wrong. I'm going to basically try and teach you not to do it rather than do it. But if you're going to do it, there's safe ways of doing it. So I'll be interested in your thoughts related to anything around restraint. I might come back with a bit of a vlog. There's been some feedback on a BBC programme which was called Don't Expel Me. And there's been some controversy because there was a restraint within that particular TV programme, which I'm inclined to agree with the complaint on that particular episode, as far as the appropriateness of restraint from the information I could see within the video. So I might do something on that a little bit later. All right, cheers.